but I'm really happy to be among my family and friends.
I think it's a wonderful plus for African Americans to be able to see themselves on television.
A lot of love and affection in our family, and our children have turned out fine.
My parents did a wonderful job, I think, instilling confidence and self-esteem.
Becoming a teacher at home, I worked so hard with my children. I wanted to share them with other children so that all the children would have an equal opportunity.
She did not allow me to use my blackness as an excuse for any kind of failure.
I would still give him this middle African name to be able to identify with Africa.
Why stay in your place when you have a mind?
Images and Realities, The African American Family. Hosted by Danny Glover, with special co-host Esther Roll.
This is the second in a series of programs designed to explore the rich tapestry of the African American people, as well as the unique experiences that have shaped our lives and contributed essential threads to the weaving of the very fabric of America. As African Americans, we see that the black family, among the strongest and most enduring of all institutions, may indeed be under siege. Despite our stumbles, we stand tall, and our families are very much alive and well. The traditional family reunion has evolved into an extraordinary celebration for African Americans. It has become a reaffirmation of our strength and resiliency. Throughout history, these gatherings allowed us to catch up on what other family members were doing, sometimes brag about successes, or find comforting words for our disappointments. But most of all, they allowed the individual to draw strength from the whole. For more and more families, the need to get together is stronger today than ever before.
There is an upsurge in family reunions as represented by Dorothy Height and the National Council of Negro Women's sponsorship of these black family reunion celebrations in 5 or 6 cities every summer, which has huge crowds. I think there is an upsurge in this in part because we're living in very difficult times, and black folks, when times get tough, reach into their own inner resources for meaning and for strength and for moving on.
The Manning family has been a part of Montgomery, Alabama for more than 150 years. Even though most family members have spread across the nation, every few years they all return to Montgomery to reconnect family bonds with family history. Katie Mae Manning Jones has seen many things from her vantage point as family matriarch.
When I was born from a white plantation owner. I'll be ready in a minute. My father was a very wealthy man. They wasn't poor people. When I was born, I was such a pretty child. His mother wanted to take me, to keep me in our home, to send me to school. But my grandfather and grandmother just refused to let me go to visit her. It was 4 of us. I'm the oldest. My father wanted to give my mother a plantation for us. But my grandfather and grandmother was so strict, they didn't let my mother accept this plantation for us.
For some, family reunions are a phone call and a few miles away. Jan and Janice Cardin's home provides the hearth which keeps their family fires burning strong.
I love being a matriarch. It's so nice to have a family where you don't have to be ashamed or make apologies. You have all these young people who are intelligent and doing things, and you feel sort of proud that you had a part in bringing them up.
My parents both came from a small town in Kentucky called Nicholasville. And they both went to school at Wilberforce, and then married right out of school, and moved first to North Carolina, and then to Atlanta, where I grew up. I went to school at the Atlanta public schools and the private schools of Atlanta University and Spelman, from which I graduated.
When I was growing up, my mother was a single parent, and I missed having my father around, I think. But my mother was someone with an incredible imagination and a curiosity about absolutely everything, which is about the most wonderful thing I think you can have in a parent.
But one of the things we've lost in this country is this sense of identity and rootedness with our own extended families. As we've moved from the South to the North, as we move from one city to another, and we're scattered all over. We need to find ways to pull all this back together.
Submitting your application for housing so that we can get you on the Section 8 program, the housing subsidy program.
Yes.
And one of the questions that came up was the fact that you have 2 children that are not your own.
No.
And I realize that those are your sister's children, but we need to prove that you have legal custody.
For Dale Richardson of Beyond Shelter in Los Angeles, family goes beyond blood ties to the African tradition of extended family. She reconstructs the safety net that has traditionally supported families' efforts to stay together.
It's very difficult. It's very hard to be the so-called professional and separate that emotion from that profession. As a matter of fact, I simply can't do that. That's why this is not a job for me. This is a commitment. It's a calling on my life. Because I'm not that far from being homeless myself. My husband's been out of work for 2 years. I know. I've been there. It's a vested interest also. I can take pride in my work because I'm investing in my family. This is my extended family. This is my family reunion that I have every day.
The extended family, where you have people who are related to each other not by marriage, but by blood, and aunts and uncles and cousins and brothers and sisters and near relatives and so on, is an African tradition.
Children are in the sense
we had like a community family because there was always so many uncles, and then there was my grandmother. She'd always somehow, you know, I used to call her radar when I was little because that woman could see everything. And I mean, it's like, God, you can't even have a boyfriend because here you come home from school, grandma looking out the window, come here, girl. My family was always there, and they always knew, and it was always somebody looking out for me.
The things about my family I like, it's just the togetherness, because we always try to, you know, stay in contact, you know, and I enjoy my mom's side of the family because a lot of my cousins, you know, they're real, they have goals and ambitions and stuff. There's a lot of pride on this side of my family.
I'm George Manning, and when I'm here and I'm around my family, my cousins, my uncles, it's a very uplifting feeling because realizing the times that we're living in and under present conditions, it's nice to be in the company of those that you can feel comfortable with, whether you're sharing remorse, if there's ill feelings, there are times and things that can be corrected through time and conversation. We have people who are enjoying each other's company, and there's a feeling of togetherness. It's not limited to just family. It's an extension of how humans should treat each other, and it begins with the family.
A long time ago, in, say, 17th century, West Africa, the concept of the extended family, which was blood relationships, was more powerful than the concept of the married couple family.
The word segregate is to put aside or divide, or yes, and stay in your place. That's the common expression, to stay in your place. Why stay in your place when you have a mind?
Despite the images, the reality of Reconstruction is that with the demise of the rural plantation system, a tidal wave of possibilities flooded the minds of the newly freed slaves. Black people rose to the challenge and developed new skills for expanding opportunities.
Cinia Reynolds was my great-great-great-great-grandmother. She was a first-generation American, born in Maryland at the end of the American Revolution. Her mother was probably born in Senegal. She was a house slave, she was a household cook, and she learned to read and write. In the 1830s, she and her husband lived by themselves and earned their own living. They did manage to buy their own freedom and to buy the freedom of 4 of their children. And then on the eve of the Civil War, they moved to Chicago.
We saw, in spite of tremendous odds, having recently been freed from slavery, there was a strong commitment in the black community to strong families, as a family as the primary essential unit.
During the early period of the industrialization of this country, blacks moved from the plantation south and the farms, agricultural regions of the south. They moved to the north. They moved in 3 patterns, essentially. They moved up the East Coast, up to New York, Buffalo, Tennessee, up to St. Louis and to Chicago and to Detroit, Milwaukee. And then blacks in Louisiana and Texas and Oklahoma went westward. The largest concentration of those black migrants, however, went up into the Midwest, to the large cities in the Midwest, like Chicago, where you'll find all of Southside Chicago, virtually large sections look quite like another black city. And they went in search of opportunity.
I graduated from Benedict College in Columbia, South Carolina with an AB degree in 1917.
Nearly a century old, Mama I.E. Williams of Jacksonville, Florida, continues to lay the image of the docile African American to rest.
Previous to that, I met my husband there. The commencement day speaker was a Dr. M.W. Reddick, who became the first president of Atlanta Baptist College, now the famous Morehouse College in Atlanta. The old school was rigid segregation. Black colleges, white colleges, black this. You go downtown, you couldn't even go to a toilet. You couldn't drink the water. And those things were gradually abolished. And only when people reported the injustices of those things, where you spend money. My husband, he was surprised when he went down there and they had the fountain colored white. He went up to the manager and demanded, what do you mean? What is it? That's God's water.
The family survived slavery in part because the Africans themselves insisted on it. But the family is a very important institution. It survived slavery. In fact, for the 100 years after slavery, the family was still very strong in the African American experience. It wasn't slavery that destroyed the family as much as some of the contemporary forces in our society today.
It's difficult living in America, being the descendant of slaves. Slavery was an interesting phenomenon in America, but people had to defend it by making the slave something other than human. And they have maintained this throughout all of these years, so that we are still considered somewhat subhuman and not as smart as, and not as beautiful as. And therefore, life has always been difficult.
Mr. and Mrs. Barnes of Chicago decided the best way to keep their family strong would be to keep the combined talents of their children under one roof.
Now, when I build a building, I didn't just build a building. As I told my architect, I didn't want to compete with the places where I grew up. I wanted to build a building that was second to none in the city of Chicago.
It's not true that black people don't stick together. Black families don't stick together. It's not true because we're an example of that, and there are many, many, many millions of examples of that. I think that's a myth that is perpetuated by people that want to put black people down.
Even though the sacrifices were many for Mr. and Mrs. Harris of Washington, D.C., the rewards of nurturing to adulthood, 1 doctor, 2 lawyers, and a college professor have been tenfold.
Well, my name is Rebecca Harris. I am originally from Camden, South Carolina. I came to Washington, D.C. in 1942.
Well, the reason why I came to Washington, D.C., I wanted a job with the federal government because I thought that a government check was second only to real money.
One of the things that strikes me about the concept of family, especially as it relates to my mother and father, you know, as you all can see, this is not a very large house. But I can remember that there were times when we had aunts, uncles, grandmother, grandfather, all living under the same roof. And the entire family knew that as long as my mother and father had a house, they always had some place to sleep. They knew that as long as my mother and father had food on the table, they always had some place to eat.
Essentially what the American black family is a reflection of adaptation to the circumstances in a strange and hostile environment. I think it is amazingly strong considering what it has gone through. Now the real question is that structure suitable for today's realities?
Prior to integration, all over the country, there were deep, deep pockets of black communities that were, you know, pretty much self-sufficient. Integration came in and said, well, look, well, we're going to let you have a part of this, whatever that meant. It was never really truly defined. But essentially what black folks were at the bottom line fighting for was better education. We needed jobs, we needed employment just as we do now.
Blacks have paid a heavy price in the struggle for equality, believing that separate could never be equal. In 1954, the NAACP successfully argued before the Supreme Court that 7-year-old Linda Brown of Topeka, Kansas, should be allowed to go to the whites-only public school. Thus ended legalized segregation, but not the racism that remained.
The desegregation effort has been an unfair burden on black children, because we're the ones that had to leave our neighborhoods and go into another setting. For the children that are a part of the desegregation effort, they've had to get an identity with the receiving school, and sometimes that just doesn't happen.
Blacks have had to fight the isolation that they felt as a group and the isolation that they felt as individuals, and I think that integration in a way has made them more isolated than made them less isolated. And what happened in integration was that they lost, in general, they lost this sense of family, they lost this sense of community, they lost this sense of identity, which they have to find for themselves as individuals.
We missed the opportunity to look more deeply at social change, and we thought integration would do the trick.
During the period when slavery was in effect, there were free people, and a majority of the free people were people who were racially mixed. And I think that's why these terms developed, because mulatto came to be related to freedom, and blackness was consigned to slavery.
Ulysses Richard, director of the Amistad Research Center in New Orleans, has spent a lifetime documenting the Creole culture and its place in the African American experience.
You know, the Creole population has been here in New Orleans and in South Louisiana since the early 1700s. I mean, one of the very first church records for the St. Louis Cathedral here is of a black couple getting married. We're talking about color schemes and other types of things in relationship to the black family, especially here in New Orleans. Color was very important. You know, there are a lot of people who don't like to talk about the color problems within the black community of New Orleans, but it's a fact of life and it's something that should be addressed. miscegenation, you know, the racial mixing, you know, people having, you know, whites and blacks, you know, living together and having children, you know, just did not happen here in New Orleans. It happened all over the country.
Veteran news anchorman Paul Berry of Washington, D.C. knows firsthand the challenges of integration and the anxieties it can create.
I took Tally from a school this year. Well, it's a great school. But I told him out of the school because he was coming home and he was concerned about his curly hair. We had a birthday party here. And there are a couple of kids that we know, families who are black with children. They were out of city and out of the town on this particular occasion. And at Tally's birthday party, everybody was white, except for myself and a friend of mine who was helping me. And we were standing outside, and he looked at me and he said, "What's wrong with this picture?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I've been thinking about that." I said, "The only thing black here was you and me and that horse that was black and white." I said, "You know, there's a problem with this."
He and his wife, Amy, are determined that their children will never have cause to question their self-worth or racial heritage.
But when he finds out that he is not like those kids, I want him to feel very comfortable with what he is like. And in order to do that, he's got to have African-American friends. He's got to have Hispanic friends. He's got to have diversity in his life. So I can do something about that. I may not be able to do about a lot of things that he will face, but this I can do something about.
Because I love you. Like,
Sleep.
I mean, I have a black husband and black children. I don't want people to look at me and say, you know, you're no good, or that your husband and your children are no good because of their skin color, for God's sake, not because of the way that they behave or the way that they think or anything, but just because of the pigmentation in their skin.
Interracial marriage is an indication that society is more open than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. It's an indication that people are coming into contact with each other across racial lines and cultural lines, and it is growing.
In slavery time, our people did not want to be, men, for instance, did not want to be free from marriage. They wanted to be free to marry. They didn't want to be free from the responsibilities of protecting and providing for their wives and children. They wanted to be free to do those things. What happened in the 60s is that white people who did not have the same kind of balance between the individual and the community that you find in the African mind and African sociality, they saw freedom from its most negatively radical perspective, which is to be completely free from all restraint.
The sixth decade of the 20th century was perhaps the most tumultuous and triumphant in the history of African Americans. For the first time, we experienced the power to determine for ourselves who we were and the place we wanted in this society. Then, in a few fateful moments, our realities shattered, one by one.
As we moved in the latter part of the 60s into the 70s on up to today, the economy was changing to a information gathering economy and an economy based upon services. Now what happened, the economy could not adjust fast enough where it could essentially employ all white people. So black folks were systematically pushed out of the economy, mainly men.
The upheavals of the 1960s were not related to the black family so much. The upheavals of the 1960s were really related to the system of American government and economics that had for generations denied people opportunity. And when you look at the riots that took place in some of our major cities, those riots really were more economically motivated and had more economic roots in deprivation as a result of racism, bigotry, and discrimination than in some kind of family structure.
The 60s offered African Americans a glimpse of what equality could look like.
When I got to American University in 1968, it was right after the riots in Washington, D.C., and they had just started a minority scholarship program. And they had kids coming from all of the D.C. public high schools to go to American University. There were about 25 of us. And we bonded together because we came from a common African-American experience, and in a lot of ways we became brothers and sisters.
We grew up understanding that being a Hudlin, there was a tradition there of excellence, and so therefore it was expected. Certainly at the end of the struggle of the 60s, when black people spilled their blood in the streets to open these institutions, of course, now the doors are open wide, we're going to step in and get what's due.
When this so-called civil rights revolution got underway, we had 3 blacks in the Congress. We got 200 and some mayors. We got 7,000 some elected officials. We start with doing an analysis of what do they do? Where are they? What kind of impact do they have? They are creating the legislation that's going to put in place tomorrow's political, economic, and social infrastructure.
Much of the freedom of the 60s, which encouraged people to strive and to want to be and to do, was accompanied by some troubling aspects of social change as well, and that had an adverse effect on families.
Public policies have, over the last 12 years, have essentially pulled that safety net from underneath families that are the most vulnerable. So I don't consider any of these problems accidental. I think that they do originate from public policies. They're not problems of morality of people or the lack thereof. They have to do with the way in which poor people, the working poor, lower middle class people, people in need, for the most part, do not rank as a high priority.
The black family has experienced tremendous stresses, probably intensified over the last decade. They have primarily to do with some economic issues, but also to do with often the lack of a community. I find that as a parent, keeping my family together and raising my children is one of the most difficult things I have to do, and it's very important to have a community around you. And I think in many urban settings, you don't have that community.
I just don't want to see you end up dead or in jail, a drunk standing in front of one of these liquor stores. Can you understand that? Look at me. I'm serious. I love you.
Concerns about the challenges faced by African American families are voiced loudest and most clearly by us.
We're now looking at the coming on to a third generation of African American families over the past 25 years who have not had stable employment and therefore have not been able to provide for their children education, have not been able to provide basic food, clothing, and shelter for them.
There is an increasing recognition on the part of the people that their families are important, that their relatives are important, that their institutions are important, their neighbors are important, and so on. But I think the politicians haven't gotten this yet. So the family values discussion is not a very meaningful discussion. If you really wanted to be meaningful about family values, you would develop policies that would enable families to feed themselves, to clothe themselves, to find meaning in life, and so on.
We also have to recognize that some of the changes that we see in black family structure are not just related to blacks, but they're related to the family structure of America. People often talk about black teenage pregnancy. Well, the fastest growing teenage pregnancy in America is not black, it's white. And that we're really going through a transition and a restructuring of the American family.
It's been a war on the Afro-American family. I used to do social work in the late 60s, early 70s. You could still do a quality service. Now with the cocaine epidemic, you have grandma, great-grandma, and mom on cocaine.
One of the tragedies of our times is that we now fear our own children, our own sons, and we don't always know how to distinguish the, in quotes, good children from the, in quotes, bad children. And if we do that, then you must imagine that whites have an even harsher perception.
There are severe economic problems in our country that are not really truly being addressed, and there are emotional problems that people have again, and I think we have a lot of work to do to create a society that's more conducive to African Americans in our country.
Like most families growing up, whenever one of us be watching TV and you see a black person walk across the screen, you'd yell out, "Black people on TV!" And everybody else in the house would stop what they're doing, rush into the room, and watch carefully as the person in the background walked across, or so-and-so set their line. And once they left the screen, then everybody would resume their activities. And, you know, clearly that says that that image has a lot of importance for the black family.
There have been many black performers who have made significant contributions to broadcasting, particularly television. But among the most definitive is Esther Rolle, who helped usher in television's first and most realistic portrayal of the African American family.
Get some hot oatmeal into your stomach. And in between, you could tell me what we're going to do about this little piece of mail that James Jr. got from the mailbox this morning.
What is it, another eviction notice?
Well, it ain't no Valentine card.
Oh, baby, we got 2 of those while you was in the hospital. But my friend Monty, who works down at the projects, he said, don't worry about it. Because they know I'm a hard-working man. They'll extend me.
Yeah, they'll extend you right out into the street. Your friend Monty don't know shellac from Shinola.
Good Times was very special to us, Danny. We tried very hard to maintain a sense of realism, while never forgetting that we were portraying just one aspect of the African-American experience.
Therein lies the problem. Achieving a balanced portrayal of black people in the media continues to be one of our greatest challenges.
The distortions and misrepresentations all began in the early days of television. The key is having more control in telling our stories our way.
Did you brush your teeth?
Yes, ma'am.
Good. Brushing your teeth wakes up your mouth. And now you can eat breakfast.
Mama, why do birds sing in the morning?
Birds sing because they're happy.
I'm happy, but I don't sing.
You're not a bird either. Eat that cereal.
Julia, she was, you know, a big influence because she was a single black parent back in the late 60s, which was, I think, a pretty bold step because it was reflective of the reality of the situation, but she was a wonderful role model because she was articulate and good-looking and just had it all together and was able to do what a lot of black women have been doing for years, which is working and raising a family alone.
Marla Gibbs combined the grit and humor of an urban black woman to define a realistic portrayal of a mother at the center of her family.
Calvin was just carrying my books for me. Let me put these away and we can go.
And just where do you think you're going, young lady?
Just over to the park, Mama. Calvin wants to show me where he goes when he wants to think about things.
Huh. Must be a very small place.
As a black American woman, as far as I'm concerned, what has to change, as far as what I'm trying to do with the values of the familial situations on television and in life, is our black images of men have got to change. We've got to allow that father figure to be there, which it is there. In a lot of instances, it is there, and people want to say that it's not, but it is. My father's there. My brothers are there with their families. As far as the mothers are concerned, as far as the children, I think we've got a problem with media.
We fight, but a lot of times you have to compromise and you can't really win all the time. You may win in one case, but in the other case you may have to kind of say, okay, well, I can make this work and make it not sound as bad or look as bad as I think it does. It's very simple. We just have to, you know, we have to write, we have to produce, we have to direct, and we have to be more in the production end.
I kind of assumed that the white audience that was going to say, well, this is not real. Black people don't live this way. But I think what really surprised me even more, and I think what hurt me even more, was that there were black people who were saying that the show was not real.
I don't think anyone of color has a problem with an affluent family. I think where that makes a problem, it makes a problem for the majority population, and that they have bought into the images that this media and other media have perpetrated on them as to what makes up a family. Not all of us grew up in one home, in a one-room shack with 16 brothers and sisters.
We have to try to educate our Caucasian brothers to say, y'all may not think this is funny, or you may not think this is how black people do, or you may only think black people do this, but let us show you the other side of the coin. Since we are black, you can't tell us how to be black, which is a big problem on TV. You know, they go, well, white people would do that. Oh, I've never heard of black. Well, you don't know a lot of black people. We do. Let us teach you. You sit down, shut up, listen, and learn from it.
There's great power, imagery of just about anyone. The imagery of black Americans can be very powerful, certainly to our youth, if it's shown right.
The images of African Americans on film have been a part of our experience for nearly a century. Painting a realistic picture of the black family on film has also been challenging. Today's films seem to put a premium on sexual aggression, violence, and materialism.
There were lots of debates about television violence and movie violence and its impact on children. And the notion that it was relieved when watching this kind of violence has been discounted. Most of the studies show a negative impact on children, that they are more aggressive in their play, that they are more likely to choose violent solutions to problems, and they have less empathy for the victim of violence.
Using the power of one's own will, tell people what you are willing and not willing to do. And if you say, making a film about family values is important to me, you say, this is the film I want to make, and hopefully you can, as a filmmaker, you package it with stars and so on, you make it attractive as a business proposition for people to make. And you simply refuse to do things which are offensive to you.
You know what? You're going to spend your night tonight thinking about your priorities after you finish your damn homework. That's what you're going to do.
Remember, you said I could go to the party.
All them hoods you got in trouble with today?
We have to, of course, show the authentic depiction of African American life. But we are well aware that we are on a collision course with Hollywood and the industry that has maintained the motion picture machine as a servant of white supremacy.
Despite the challenges African Americans face in bringing a realistic depiction of who we are to the screen, there have been some wonderful moments.
I think my mother refused to be stereotyped because no one in her family had ever been stereotyped. And I think that she fought against that because I think she had been taught to grow up to believe that she could define herself and not be defined by other people, not be defined by white society.
Danny and I were fortunate to remake for television A Raisin in the Sun, one of the first and most realistic portrayals of the African-American family.
I don't know. You think we ought to give her this? Seems to me she ain't been very cooperative around here.
What is it? Well, what do you think? Should we give it to her?
Oh, she was pretty good today.
Oh, pretty good, you.
Open it, Mama.
Yeah, open it, Mama. It's for you. Read the note. Ruth wrote the note.
To our own Mrs. Miniver, love from Brother, Ruth, and Benitha. Ain't that lovely? Although visual imagery has proven to be a powerful force, the strength of the written word should never be minimized. Few of us will ever forget the tragic revelation in the black press in 1955.
The lynching of Emmett Till. It was carried in Jet magazine, and it just rivaled the entire community over the fact that what was transpiring. Sure, Rosa Parks sat down on the bus. Sure, there was a Martin Luther King Jr., but had it not been for the black press, no one would have ever known about that. We've always been at the cutting edge as far as news is concerned. And the thing that really disturbs me is over the type of cooperation we get from blacks in general, especially from black professionals in particular, because they never give the black press the type of credit that they should give. You go in an office, you'll see a Washington Post, you'll see a New York Times, you'll see a Los Angeles Times, but you won't see a black newspaper on their desk. Professionals should realize had it not been for the black press, you wouldn't be where you are.
The ability to read ensures the power to learn. And the one lesson parents have passed on from one generation to the next is when you learn better.
Well, there are two things I learned from my father. When I was very young, when my father would come home, he would read, constantly reading. And I thought, must be some real joy in that, because he read so much. So at an earliest age, I started reading. And they watched me read, and they decided, well, there must be some joy in that.
Reading African folklore and reading how the baby leopard got his spot over the cassette, and you hear, you know, native music and what the Kimbala sounds like, I think, or, you know, just learning part of the African tradition, or as much as you can instill as an American.
It was a good thing you did do, a brave thing. We're both thankful to you.
Thank you, Nufi. Thank you.
No matter what you think, son, you did the right thing.
The Learning Tree, 1963 or something like 62. I asked the librarians and the English teachers, white and black, who teach it in the schools. I said, what do you like about the Learning Tree? Why does it not go out of print? They said, look, it's so well balanced. We see good blacks in there, we see bad blacks, we see bad whites, and good whites.
There's so many stories that need to be told about our future as a people. So I've got quite some time to tell quite a few stories.
You can be from the ghetto, and I have the ghetto in you. I think that the ghetto stopped at our door. When you came inside the house, and there were values there, values of hard work. You could not just lay around. You had to do something.
The image of African American can be one-sided distortion. Although we do face the very real challenges of crime, violence, and lack of economic opportunities, our communities remain amazingly strong and grounded in the tradition of family.
Parenting is very important to me. It is one of the most important things I do. Our 3 children were born not out of lust or accidentally. They were born because we chose to have children. And I feel it is my responsibility not only to provide for them, but to nurture them. So parenting on the part of myself is one of the most important things I do.
See so many talented people, many of whom I grew up with, fall by the wayside. And I look at them, I go, well, I was in class with them, they're as smart as me, they're as charismatic as me, there's no reason why they couldn't do what I'm doing. And I say, what's the difference? And the difference was clearly the parents that I had.
I had a sense of possibility and a self-confidence. So I would say that level of self-confidence is come from an early childhood reinforcement.
My mother tried very much to shield me from, she called the vicissitudes of showbiz, which she never liked. And she was strict. I was expected to be disciplined and well-behaved. And she was loving, and we had fun together.
You know, the values in your family have to be devoted to self-worth, because I think as Black Americans, that's been one of the problems that's plagued us over years. So I think that we as parents have to be very aggressive in educating and giving our children something that they're not going to be able to find out there in the school systems necessarily.
It's a shame that there aren't as many of the extended family as I think we used to have. But it's great to incorporate it. That's one of the reasons why I chose to move back closer to my family. So not only would we be an influence on our kids, but you know, my parents' influence in education and knowledge would also help to make them develop.
My parents were always very hard workers, and they made a lot of sacrifices, and they made a lot of sacrifices out of their love for us. A lot of the sacrifices were to put us through some of the best schools, to give us opportunities to participate in extracurricular activities so we can develop other parts of our personalities as well.
My wife's mother lives with us. So our children are able to see their mother and their grandmother and able to see parenting from two those. But most importantly, they're able to see how her mother, who is really my mother too, how we interact with her and how we care for her.
I got a 3-flat building, and don't nothing stay here but me and my grandchildren and my daughter. I got 2 more grandkids, but they stay out in Oak Park. So we stays together and we talks to one another.
And if it wasn't for, I wouldn't know what I would have done. I would have had to worry about after-school care, getting them to school, bringing them back, and she enabled me, or living in this area around my family, enabled me to do a lot of things that I see people struggling with today.
But one thing that's important to me, though, is for everything to start in the home. Education, no matter what, it has to start in the home. You teach your child respect. He has to respect his teachers, his elders, even other children. That's it, because that's why life is so cheap today, because people have no respect for their own life. They're not going to respect anyone else's life.
Powerful statements. These are testimonials to the traditional strength that has seen our families and our communities through many tests of endurance. The values are there: the nurturing, the respect for truth, the love of family and community. These are aspects of our daily life so integral to our nature that we sometimes forget.
Children learn more by what their parents and what their mentors do rather than what their mentors or parents say. So if they see hardworking people around them, people whose goals are to make a comfortable life and a beautiful life, I think that can be some inspiration for the young people.
For many African Americans, the church, like the Center of Hope here in Oakland, California, symbolizes a unique circle of friendship, the heart of the community, a constant beacon of light.
Don't give up. Don't give up. Don't give up.
I have a combination of Western African griot, storyteller, as well as the Western African tribal chief. And so that much of the concept of, the tribal chieftain is a part of what it means to be a pastor. I know a number of young preachers who, in attempting to run their churches like one would run a business, strictly a business, lose sight of the fact that it is really a family. I mean, that's what a tribe was. It was
independent, the most self-supported institution in the whole African-American community. There may be about 70% of African-Americans who belong to some church or other. About 7% go to church at least once a month.
The Wilsons of New York, a family strong and loving, steeped in the warm tradition of church, full of strength and inspiration.
Most young people made fun of the fact that we went to church every night. They called us the Goody Goody Wilsons. They wrote on our door. They laughed. They made a lot of fun.
What teenagers try to do is to make you feel as if you should be like everybody else. And I always saw being different by going to church as being something positive.
Then I kept them in the church where maybe they didn't want to go, but I can thank God that I kept them in there, because that was the backbone to help me, because it was doing what I was doing at home.
It is the family that shapes our view of the world. It provides us with a sense of security, our sense of possibilities.
Well, it's unfortunate the kids that you see running around that are supposedly bad kids, they weren't born bad. They're bad because their parents or parent didn't take time with them, didn't, give them the love that they needed, the time and the attention that they needed.
We need to have that continuous chain to provide those young people who are coming along now, and help not only in terms of financial support or strengthening our institutions, motivation, ideas, helping a young person broaden or extend his or her horizon.
I think the world is so fraught with difficulties that you have to be aware of how dangerous the outside world is and have to let your children know, but at the same time give them the courage to put their foot out into it, to step into it, and not be too afraid to try to be themselves.
Throughout our history and move forward, grounded in the traditions of our people and aspiring to the wisdom of our parents, we have resolved to continue building our lives and taking care of our children. We have resolved to continue winning.
My grandchild I just produced a fine little girl, graduate from Winthrop College. And so in my day, black people walk on that sidewalk where the school for girls.
Despite the images that challenge and too often affect our realities, the African-American family continues to provide some of the most brilliant and vibrant threads in the American tapestry.
I have a pretty big safety net here. If I'm finding any difficulties at all, I have no trouble, and I've been encouraged throughout my life just to come.
The same love for the children whom my grandchildren, the young people whom my grandchildren selected as friends and as companions. So my family keeps extending, and I think it's just wonderful.
If you got it in yourself, you're going to do it in spite of role models or not. You don't care. My role models are my mother and father, as I was telling you, and my brother.
Tell a young mother to really watch the company their children keep. That's what I always told my children. I know you by the company you keep.
The world has benefited enormously from the struggles have taught this nation and the world is that every human being, no matter whether they are of a different color, of different religion, or different economic class, has the...
There's a tremendous reservoir of strength that we can draw from our history.
The African-American family has always been the benchmark of social conditions. Our survival as a nation depends on the realization that our concerns are interconnected, our destinies intertwined. I'm Danny Glover.
And I'm Esther Rowe.
I think all over this country, in every kind of institution and community and home, there ought to be teaching of what our history has been and how we have overcome. That'll help us know how difficult it's going to be in the future. It's going to be. in the future. See, at the bottom of African American culture, a set of values of faith and of hope and of optimism, and things can be done, and we can overcome because we have overcome.
Images and Realities, the African American Family, was first made possible by AT&T. This special encore presentation